Hi everyone, this is going to be a review of the standard for the USV 8 in the United States and Virginia history curriculum. The standard reads, the student will demonstrate knowledge of how the nation grew and changed from the end of Reconstruction through the early 20th century by explaining the relationship among territorial expansion, westward movement of the population, new immigration, growth of the cities, the role of the railroads, and the admission of new states to the United States. B. Describing the transformation of the American economy from a primarily agrarian to a modern industrial economy and identifying major inventions that improved life in the United States. C. Analyzing prejudice and discrimination during this time period with emphasis on Jim Crow and the responses of Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. DuBois. D. Identifying the causes and impacts of the progressive movement, including the excesses of the Gilded Age, child labor and antitrust laws, the rise of labor unions, and the success of the women's suffrage movement. The essential understandings that the state of Virginia wants you to take away are that in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, economic opportunity, industrialization, technological change, and immigration fueled American growth and expansion. Additionally, during the period from the Civil War to World War I, the United States underwent an economic transformation that involved the development of an industrial economy, the expansion of big business, the growth of large-scale agriculture, and the rise of national labor unions and industrial conflict. Also, discrimination against and segregation of African Americans intensified and took new forms in the late 19th century and early 20th century. African Americans disagreed about how to respond to those developments. Lastly, the period from Reconstruction through the early 20th century was a time of contradictions for many Americans. Agricultural expansion was accomplished through wars against the Plains Indians, leading to new federal Indian policies. Industrial development brought a great fortunes to a few and raised the standard of living for millions of Americans, but also brought about the rise of national labor unions and clash between industry and labor. Social problems in rural and urban settings gave rise to third-party movements and the beginning of the progressive movement. Some essential questions that you should consider while we're going through this is that what factors influenced American growth and expansion in the late 19th and early 20th century? What fueled the modern industrial economy? How did race relations in the South change after Reconstruction, and what was the African American response? How did the excesses of the Gilded Age contribute to the development of the progressive movement? And what were the goals of progressives, and what were their accomplishments? So diving into the meat of the information here a little bit, we're going to be talking about Westward Movement. And you can see as this GIF here continues and is going to kind of show us over and over again the expansion into the Western territories and how that went about between the 1700s and 1800s and as all the states kind of came into the Union. But really what we should consider is that, following the Civil War, this westward movement is going to drastically intensify, right? It's going to rapidly shape up in this region between the Mississippi River and now the Pacific Ocean. And there's going to be different things that are going to really fuel this and the different opportunities such as railroads that are going to allow access. You're going to have mining opportunities for things like gold and silver and other precious metals. You're going to have the cattle industry and the cow towns, as well as ranching eventually take shape. And then additionally, you're just going to have this access to cheap and free land for the settlers that are moving westward. So this is just another animation here to kind of show the population density as we move westward here. So if you just watch that for a second, it should give you a clear idea of population densities going into about 2000. The years following the Civil War are going to be marked by this era known as for the American Cowboy. The open range in the American West is going to be marked by these long cattle drives where these cowboys are going to take these cattle from down here in Texas, and they're going to essentially work in groups and drive large numbers of them up into the railroads, right? And the reason why they're doing this is because once they get them to the railroads, they are actually able to sell them for significantly more than what they are worth down in Texas, almost 10 times as much. So while this drive could be fairly dangerous and also problematic for these people. It was ultimately worth it if they could do it successfully, right? If you drive, thousands of these cattle to the north, that you can take a good amount of money at that point. And when they get to the railroads, what would happen is these cattle will then be shipped out either eastward or westward while they are live, and then ultimately butchered in the cities in the east and west. Also, you're going to now have many Americans needing to rebuild their lives after the Civil War, right? And what's going to happen is during the war, Abraham Lincoln is actually going to pass what's known as the Homestead Act of 1862, which is going to give free public land in the Western territories to settlers who are going to make the trip and live on this land, as long as they basically $10 filing fee. And you could get hundreds of acres of free land, and many people in the attempt to kind of rebuild their lives are going to respond to this incentive and make the move. So many Southerners are going to do this, in addition to African Americans now in particular, who are going to be trying to escape the South and the persecution that they were kind of facing down there, but also just because many of these freed men just had nowhere to go, right? So this opportunity was something that they couldn't pass up, and we're going to now head westward up into these areas looking for this cheap or free land. Other cheap land is also going to be offered by the railroad companies, that as they headed westwards, and you actually now have the Transcontinental Railroad that's going to be completed, and then other spurs of that, you are going to have people looking to fill up these markets now. So if it's just open land in between, then there's not much incentive there for the railroads to build, right? But if you now start getting towns along the way on these railroad lines, these markets are going to expand, and railroads had been offered this money by the this land by the American government to be able to sell it as incentive to kind of complete the railroads. We know that initially life on the plains is going to be pretty tough for the average settler, right? The land is not necessarily easy to farm. You're going to have a bunch of these different grasses that are really hard to rip up. Houses, there's no real building materials, so as far as lumber and things, especially before the railroad gets there. So what's going to happen is people are actually building building houses of dirt and grass, essentially. You have some really harsh weather conditions where you're going to get some extreme cold in the winter and extreme heat in the summer, and droughts and things like that. You're also going to have this picture on the top right here is actually grasshoppers and locusts that are going to plague the Midwest and the life in the plains and destroy large numbers of these crops of these people occasionally. So life on the West was pretty hard for your initial settlers. And we know that technology typically makes life easier for people, and in the West, there is not going to be an exemption from this, right? So these new technologies help to open up the lands in the West for settlement. The big one is the railroad we've been talking about. Once those transcontinental railroad lines are complete, it's going to allow for now access to the West much more easily. They're going to be able to ship crops out much more easily, or cattle, but they're also going to be able to ship in materials to build houses and towns and things like this much more effectively as well, right? In addition to that, you're going to see other technologies, things like the mechanical reaper, which is an invention here down you can see on the bottom right, where that while the horse drags this device, it's going to cut the grain and cut the crops for you, making things a whole lot easier. So these new technological advancements are really going to make life easier for the people in the West, especially after things like we had just talked about on the previous slide, right? And ultimately, by the turn of the century, around 1900, the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountain regions of the American West are really no longer considered this unsettled frontier, right? And they were vastly, very quickly becoming regions for farms and ranches and towns and filling up, as you saw in the population density maps earlier. And while this is all going on, we also come to one of the largest kind of marks on American history here, where we know that we're going to have this forcible removal of the American natives from these lands as we continue this push. They're going to be the natives are going to be continued to kind of be brought into smaller and smaller reservation lands, and there are going to be wars that are fought between the different groups of natives and the Americans, and ultimately, the last kind of bands of free natives are going to surrender in 1924. So one thing that we need to remember with history is that there's a lot of different moving parts all at once, right? So while all this westward expansion that we were just talking about is going on, there's other things going on elsewhere in the country, in particular in the cities, that's going to help really fuel the industrialization after the American Civil War, right? So these technological changes are really going to help spur the growth of industries, and primarily in areas like New York and Philadelphia and Boston, Detroit and such, right? So some of these inventions that you have corporations. The whole idea of limited liability corporations is going to become a thing. You're going to have the Bessemer steel process, the light bulb, electricity, the telephone, the airplane, and just more efficient means of manufacturing along assembly lines that are super important towards the industrialization of this country. So let's look at these all individually quick, right? So you have the Bessemer steel process, which is a process that is developed over in Europe, and this process is going to effectively make it much more easy and more efficient to create steel, right? So when this is brought to America, it's going to have a huge effect on our cities, and that's when we're going to start to get skyscrapers and large structures such as big bridges and things that are going to really allow this can take off. This construction is going to take off in this country. So next you are going to have the light bulb, invented by Thomas Edison. This incandescent light bulb is actually invented in New Jersey. And this now, in the invention as well as the push by Edison, among others, is going to really now make for the change toward electricity as a source of power and light, and away from the kerosene that had kind of done the trick prior to this. You are going to have Alexander Graham Bell in 1876, who is awarded the first patent for the telephone, which is going to change communication forever, right? Being able to directly, verbally communicate with people over long distances changes the game quite a bit. You have the airplane, invented by the Wright brothers, Orville and Wilbur, and they complete the first powered flight on December 17th, 1903 at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. And there on the right, you can kind of see a picture of this first flight. Next, you're going to have Henry Ford, who's going to take a bunch of unskilled laborers, put them together, get them really good at one particular part of a process, and put them in a line, and in doing so, completely revolutionize the production process in factories, creating an assembly line, which is a much more efficient means of creating something. Next, we're going to be talking about some of the largest business interests of the day, and business tycoons, if you will. The first being a man named Cornelius Vanderbilt, who develops this nickname of the Commodore, and is going to build his wealth around the railroads, and in particular shipping of things after the Civil War, right? And he is going to control the major rail lines in and around New York City, and in doing so, having monopoly on these particular lines is essentially going to make him one of the wealthiest men in America at this time. Next, you have John D. Rockefeller, who makes his fortune in the oil business with the creation of the Standard Oil Company, which is a company that essentially takes over the entire oil industry, creating a kerosene that is standardized in quality, that is going to be shipped out to the cities and all over the country as a means of safer lighting up our streets and lighting up the homes of America before electricity. After that, you have Andrew Carnegie, who is going to build his empire in the steel industry. He is going to have been abroad in Europe and essentially see the Bessemer process in work, and he is going to bring that back to America, and in doing so is going to create a much more efficient process for creating steel in America, which is going to grow into this multi-million-dollar empire that's going to help build America's cities and bridges all over the country. You also have a man named James P. Morgan, who is a financier who had been up to this point known for buying bankrupt railroads and combining and reorganizing these into single entities and making them effective again, essentially, and making his money that way, potentially even selling those railroads off once they become effective. But ultimately, he is going to also be known for other business ventures as well. He is going to purchase Carnegie Steel for about $500 million at the time period, and also help run General Electric with Thomas Edison. The question comes down to now, why was America kind of ripe for this economic transformation that took place at the time? And one of the big reasons is this idea of laissez-faire capitalism, right? This idea that leaving business kind of be no real regulations of the time period is what's going to really allow for this rapid growth, but going to come at the expense of a number of the things that we're going to be talking about later in this video. You also have this concept of special considerations. So, for example, land grants giving to the railroad builders as they traveled west. They could then sell that land for a profit, and this was their incentive to do this, right? So some of those reasons were a big part of this. You're also going to have this increasing labor supply of the immigration and immigrants coming into America from all over the place, right? And also now migration away from the farms into the urban areas of the country. So all of this now, supply of labor is going to help fuel the industrialization as well. And on top of that, just America's possession of wealth and natural resources at the time period, and even still today, is a huge part of our nation's wealth. And on top of that, you're also now going to have the navigable rivers and canals that had been built, and on top of the railroads that are going to now allow for easy transportation of all of these things that are being produced. And as I was just saying, immigration really is going to be one of the major reasons why we have such a large labor pool in the United States. It's going to help fuel this industrialization. So let's take a look at it real quick. So prior to 1871, most of the immigrants to America came from Northern and Western Europe. So countries like Germany, Great Britain, Ireland, Norway, Sweden. But during the second half century, really between 1871 and 1921, most of these immigrants, now it's going to shift. You're going to have a different wave of immigration coming from other places in Europe, in particular Southern and Eastern Europe, and in addition to Asia at this point. So you're going to have Italy, Greece, Poland, Russia, present-day Hungary, and the former Yugoslavia. You have China and Japan as well heading to the West Coast. Right, and like earlier immigrants, these immigrants came to America looking for freedoms and to better their lives for their families for any sort of reasons like jobs, escaping persecution, and things like that in their home countries. And as you can see by this graph, you can kind of see those waves of immigration and where they were coming from based off of time. And it is undeniable that these immigrants made valuable contributions to the dramatic industrial growth of America during this time period, right? You have the Chinese workers that helped to build the Transcontinental Railroad. You have immigrants working in the textile industry and steel mills in the Northeast, as well as the clothing industry in New York City. You have the Slavs, Italians, and Poles that are moving a little inland, and they're working in the coal mines of the East, really in the Appalachian Mountains. And then they are also going to be working for very low pay and often enduring dangerous working conditions to help build up this nation's industrial strength. And this is the kind of the trade back of these lack of regulations and this whole idea of laissez-faire capitalism that was existing in the time period. So during this time period, right, the immigrants were coming in from Europe. They entered in through Ellis Island in the New York Harbor, and often their first view of America was the Statue of Liberty as their ships arrived across the Atlantic Ocean from this voyage. And here you can see, actually, I like this picture. It's a colorized image of the Statue of Liberty in the late 1800s, and you can actually kind of see that coppery color of the Statue of Liberty still before it oxidized into the green that we have today. And then you have a picture there of Ellis Island on the bottom. And when these immigrants got to America, they began the process of assimilating to be American, right, into what has been kind of dubbed this melting pot of America, where they were often settling into ethnic neighborhoods in these growing cities, and they often worked hard to learn English themselves and teach their kids English and to become American, right, adopt American customs, really become American citizens. And especially early on, these people were kind of trying to get away from their home countries, so they were really trying to fully embrace themselves in American culture often. You also have public schools becoming relevant at this point, and compulsory education, and this is going to kind of serve as an essential role in the process of assimilating these immigrants into American society, and really still does today for immigrants coming into America. But despite these valuable contributions that these immigrants made to building America, they're going to often face hardship and hostility, again, much like today, right? There was often fear and resentment that these immigrants would be taking jobs for less pay than the American workers that they would accept, and that there was prejudice based on these religious and cultural differences here. And you can see a fairly interesting anti-immigration cartoon here where you have an Irishman and a German basically dressed up in these in alcohol barrels, stealing the ballot box as people were fighting off in the background, that they were taking the ballot box and maybe stuffing the ballot box and rigging the elections in their favors. And this is going to arouse this anti-immigration sentiment by seeing these cartoons. And here are two more of these, right? So you have this proposed immigrant dumping site of Ellis Island, where you have these immigrants being dropped off on the Statue of Liberty right here, and says, "Mr. Wyndham, if you are going to make the island a garbage heap, I am going back to France," said the Statue of Liberty. So you also have this one on the right, where it says, "The great fear of the period is that Uncle Sam may be swallowed up by the foreigners," and you have these fairly racist depictions of the Chinese person right here, kind of swallowing up Uncle Sam. And all of this mounting resentment is going to lead Congress to actually limit immigration in the United States. And in particular, the first big act is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, where they were actually going to bar the Chinese from entering the country. And then they are going to further restrict immigration with the Restriction Act of 1921. And these laws effectively are going to cut off most of immigration to America for the next several decades. However, the immigrants of this period and their descendants contribute to the American society continuously throughout this time period, even though you're not getting any real new immigration at this time. And here you have one last cartoon that the Chinese person kind of sitting out the Golden Gate of Liberty, even though, as you can see on the sign, the communists, the socialists, and such are still going to be allowed into the United States. So as the nation's industrial growth continues, you're going to now be getting cities such as Chicago and Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and New York growing very rapidly, becoming manufacturing and transportation centers. And you can see on this graph up here, right, between 1890 and 1920, New York is going to expand 336%. Los Angeles is going to expand over 1,000% It's a pretty large, rapid transformation of these major cities in this country during this time period. And the factories in these large cities are going to provide jobs, but workers are often going to live in these harsh conditions, crowded into what are called tenement buildings, which are essentially apartment buildings of the time, and slums. But these tenements were really not great places to live. They were often one room, basically no bathrooms and things like that, and they're crowding in these people just because that's what they could afford. And the rapid growth of these cities is going to lead toward housing shortages and also the need for new public services to effectively deal with the people that are now in these cities, right? You're going to need sewage systems to get rid of the filth of the people. You're going to need water systems to provide clean water to all the millions of people now living in these cities. In addition, people are going to need to get around, right? So you're going to begin to build subway systems and public transportation and trolley cars. And New York City was the first city to begin construction of a subway system around the turn of the 20th century. And many cities are going to build, as I said, these trolley and street line cars, so kind of above ground trains and light rails for their people. And often this industrialization era also becomes defined as called the Gilded Age. And gilded means specifically covering thinly with gold leaf or gold paint. And what I guess they try to mean by this is that the excesses by the elites and wealthy essentially thinly veiled the society to make it seem better than things actually were, right? These really wealthy people had great lives. And in fact, they had some of these modern conveniences as they came out, right? And these lavish lifestyles covered up the major income disparities between the rich and the poor, the business practices of these industrialists that could also be called these robber barons, and also control of the government by these robber barons and the money interests that are effectively buying legislation that's going to help them the best that they can. And the working conditions during the Gilded Age were defined essentially by these dangerous working conditions in these factories. You're going to have child labor and kids very small working in these machines and oftentimes being hurt and maimed and injured. You're going to have long hours, low pay, no job security, no benefits. You're going to have this idea of company towns where people live in these company towns as long as they can work there, but if they get hurt in the mines or something like that, say they lose everything. You're going to have underemployment of women or just no employment at all. And here you can kind of see some of these conditions in these crowded factories, or as you can see down there on the bottom left, these people that were building these skyscrapers with essentially no safety harnesses and things like that. There is also this very famous political cartoon by Joseph Kepler depicting the bosses of the Senate, and you can see all of these big money interests, these big sacks of money representing the different business interests like Standard Oil Trust and the Steel Beam Trust and all the other different trusts you can see where they are looming over the politicians below with their money. You can see this direct entrance for the monopolists on the top right, and where it says this is the Senate of the monopolists, by the monopolists, and for the monopolists, with the people's interests in the top left being closed. So it's just showing that the politicians are listening to the monopolists and what they want as far as laws while ignoring the people. So with all of those problems that we had now kind of talked about a little bit, you are going to have a pushback, right? People won't live in those conditions for they only live there for so long. And what you're going to get now is in response is known as the progressive era and the progressive movement, which is going to be attempting to use government to institute reforms for those problems that had been created by the industrialization. You're going to have two, in particular, progressive presidents that you need to know about. You have a man named Teddy Roosevelt, who is known for his square deal, among other things, which we'll be going further into later on, and a man named Woodrow Wilson and his ideas of new freedom is what it's called. But largely, when it comes down to it, progressive goals include trying to get government controlled by the people again, and not necessarily these big money interests that we had just been talking about, and also giving them a little bit more control over the government. Also guaranteeing economic opportunities through government regulation. So this time period of laissez-faire capitalism is kind of slowly coming to an end, and also just simply trying to eliminate social injustices in general across the board. So you have people that are attempting to kind of point out this corruption and point out the problems in society, and these people are often known as muckrakers, and they are often reform-minded journalists who attack the established institutions and leaders as corrupt and therefore attempting to rake the muck, right? So four of them that you should familiarize yourself with are a man named Jacob Riis, who writes this book known as How the Other Half Lives, which is kind of a photographic essay on some level of the slums and the tenements and the terrible conditions that the immigrants are being forced to live in New York City, which is going to arouse quite a big deal of people that are just upset about this, and you're going to kind of get better living conditions over the next number of years as a result. You have a person named Ida Tarbell who attacks Standard Oil for their monopolistic practices and is going to help lead and pave the way for the antitrust legislation that's going to be kind of pushing back against the monopolies, in particular the Sherman Antitrust Act. You're going to have Joseph Kepler, the political cartoonist that created the last cartoon we just looked at, but also the one there on the bottom left about immigration, among many others, right? And he's going to be pointing out these things to everyone. And then you also have Upton Sinclair, who writes the book The Jungle, which is regarding the kind of the conditions in the meatpacking industry, meant to in particular look at the labor conditions in the meatpacking industry, but everyone kind of focuses on the quality of meat and what people are being fed, and these things are going to kind of lead to changes in society, right? So you have down there on the bottom right Teddy Roosevelt raking the muck and cleaning up the meat scandal with an investigation. you are also now going to get labor unions. And a labor union is an organized association of workers, often in a trade or profession, formed to protect and further the rights and interests of these people, right? So one of the first groups you should know are the Knights of Labor, which is going to be one of these first labor unions, followed by the American Federation of Labor, led by a man named Samuel Gompers, which is just going to kind of swell and grow. We're talking sometimes in the millions of people in these labor unions, which are trying to kind of gain leverage back to the workers so that they can work towards better working conditions, right? You also have the American Railway Union, led by Eugene Debs, who is going to run for president of the Socialistic Party in America a number of times. And you're also going to have the International Ladies Garment Workers Union as well. And here you can just see a quick picture of these garment workers, these ladies that are striking and working towards better conditions for themselves. So with people striking, things often sometimes get violent, and there are three major strikes that you should be aware of. One is at Haymarket Square in Chicago, where you're going to have police that had opened fire at a number of these strikers, and the next day when the strike continued, you're going to have anarchists throw a bomb at the police officers at Haymarket Square and kill a number of police officers, and you're going to have people dead on both sides, and it's pretty gruesome. This is going to kind of something that's going to basically make people look at labor unions a little differently, and membership is going to begin to decline after this. You are also going to have the Homestead Strike, which is a major strike by steelworkers in Pittsburgh, and it's going to be squashed by basically paid mercenaries from the Carnegie Steel Corporation, in addition with the Pennsylvania State Militia. You're going to then also have the Pullman Strike, which is a major nationwide railway strike by the American Railway Union in response to wage reduction. That's going to be, again, very disruptive across the country. That's eventually going to be broken up by the American government because they are going to say that they were disrupting the mail. But ultimately, the blood, sweat, and tears of the progressive and the labor unions are going to lead to gains across society, right? You're going to get the implementation of child labor laws. You're going to get limited working hours, regulated work conditions that are going to be just generally safer for people. You're going to get the push for antitrust legislation, the Sherman Antitrust Act preventing businesses that are monopolies, right? Breaking up these large businesses into smaller entities and trusts. So you also have the Clayton Antitrust Act, which is going to just further expand the Sherman Antitrust Act, push against this idea of these monopolies price fixing, but it's also going to exempt unions from this Sherman Act. You're going to get primary elections, which are going to allow people to directly choose their candidates for president and high office. You're going to have the direct election of U.S. senators with the 17th Amendment, and the whole idea of secret ballots making it so people can vote in private, right? That's pretty important to be able to vote how you feel you should. Other progressive accomplishments include, in particular in local governments, right? So new forms of government are going to have the commissioner style and city manager style. That's going to meet needs of increasing urbanization. It's going to have more people having direct influence of the high offices in these cities. You're going to have in state governments the idea of referendums, which is a general vote by the electorate on a single political question that has been referred to them for a direct decision to, again, create laws. The initiative is a process that enables citizens to bypass their state legislatures altogether and then place these proposed actions by the people directly on the ballot for the people to decide if it should be a law or not. And you're also going to have a recall, which is a procedure by which voters can remove an elected official from office through voting before the term has ended if they are unhappy with how that elected official has been governing, which is a pretty big deal. Then you're going to have the primary elections, which I was just talking about, the direct election of senators instead of being elected through the House of Representatives, which is the way they had been, and then lastly, the secret ballot. At this same time, you're going to have the push for women's suffrage, the right for women to vote, right? And this is going to be kind of the forerunner of the modern protest movements, but they are going to greatly benefit from strong leadership from people like Susan B. Anthony in particular. It's going to encourage women to enter the labor force, especially during World War I, and their role during World War I is going to help result in the passing of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, which is going to guarantee women the right to vote. In the South, you have Jim Crow laws and other restrictions, right? Jim Crow laws are lawful segregation that had been being passed by state legislatures during the after Reconstruction. The laws require African Americans and whites to be separated in public buildings, right? We also know there are voting restrictions pushed by the Southerners against the African Americans. You have things like poll taxes and literacy tests and grandfather clauses, which are going to aid whites, exempting anyone whose ancestors had voted in 1860, which obviously, if you were a freed slave, that was not the case. You have intimidation and crimes against the African Americans, such as lynchings by groups like the KKK, trying to prevent them to participate in politics so that they try to keep them down in society, right? That's the point. That's the hope of these people anyway in the South, and that's what is occurring. African Americans and the freed slaves were hoping to look to the courts to safeguard their rights, and effectively, this isn't necessarily going to be the case. You're going to have the passing, what's called Plessy versus Fergusson in the Supreme Court. It's a case from 1896 that's going to rule this idea of separate but equal, that this did not violate the 14th Amendment and therefore upholds the state Jim Crow laws of the era, right? And by having the separation being okay, as long as African Americans had access to public facilities or accommodations which they said were equal to those of whites, which we also know was not truly really ever the case. And this concept of separate but equal is going to be legalized for more than 50 years now, until the civil rights movements of the 1950s and 1960s in the strong pushback against it. And in response to these issues that are going on in the South during the early 20th century, African Americans are going to begin what is known as the Great Migration. They are going to kind of begin to push out of the South, where they are being persecuted, to northern cities in search of jobs and to escape poverty and discrimination in the South. But to tell you the truth, in the North, things aren't so much better in a lot of cases. There's a lot of racial discrimination in a lot of these cities as well, and that's just for another time. So anyway, prominent African Americans figures are merged to help tackle injustices and to fight for the rights of these African Americans. People like Ida B. Wells, Booker T. Washington, and W.E.B. DuBois. Ida B. Wells is going to lead an anti-lynching crusade and call upon the federal government to take action against this injustice. W.E.B. DuBois believes that education is essentially meaningless without equality, and he is going to support equality for African Americans by helping to form what is known as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, which is going to play a prominent role now going forward in pushing for civil rights for African Americans. And in contrast to that, you have a man named Booker T. Washington, who believes that essentially equality was through education, by getting people educated and being able to work for themselves and have economic success through that, that's how they're gonna become equal, right? So he creates what's known as the Tuskegee Institute, and effectively is pushing education over anything else to help level the playing field a little bit as much as they can for African Americans. Well, that is it for this standard, so until next time.